Great, thank you. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. I guess I'm going to be talking a little bit more generally about rewilding, and then towards the end of the presentation, I will link that up with woodland creation. So bear with me while I just whip through a whistle-stop tour around rewilding and some of the work we're doing to support that, as well as then how it links into woodland creation and provide some project examples at the end. So yeah, my name's Sara King. I'm Rewilding Manager at Rewilding Britain. And just to try and make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about rewilding, I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but our definition of rewilding is the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature can take care of itself. So at the start of rewilding projects, there will often be a lot of interventions, whether it's rewiggling rivers or maybe in some cases tree planting, to restore some of the pieces that are missing from those natural processes, and then put in place those different pieces to then allow nature to take care of itself. So it's a very long-term thinking approach to land management, and actually does have overlap with a lot of other approaches that we might take. It also encourages a balance between people and nature. We are actually part of natural processes, and often we will be mimicking natural processes through harvesting animals to control their numbers, or through some of the other elements that we work to, including even taking timber from some of these systems. So I think it's seeing us as being very much part of these systems rather than separate from it. And then from that definition, we also have 5 principles of rewilding, and this is supporting people and nature together. So as I've just said, making sure that we recognise that we're part of the system, not separate from it. Working at nature's scale, and scale is really important. I've got a slide next to tell you a little bit more about scale, but when we're talking about rewilding, we're really trying to look at the landscape scale, because we need space to allow those natural processes to act. Letting nature lead is obviously a very key element of rewilding, and not having set outcomes, but putting the measures in place to then allow nature to lead the way is incredibly important. Creating resilient nature-based economies, and I've got in a couple of slides time talking about some of the benefits of rewilding and how that can support jobs and volunteer opportunities. And also thinking about things in the long term. Often we think of things in terms of funding cycles, so that might be 5, 10, 25 years. But actually when we're talking about rewilding, we're talking about many generations, and quite a lot of rewilding projects are actually developing 100-year vision, 200-year vision. One has even put their 1,000-year vision together. So it's changing our way of how we look at land management and looking more at that long-term approach. Maybe it will be an initial sprint start through some of the interventions, but rewilding should really be viewed as a marathon. And as I said, scale is really important. So we're just trying to show on here the opportunities to increase that scale with rewilding. And we see rewilding as being part of a spectrum. So on this graph, the green dots are typical UK nature reserves. So these tend to be smaller, and they tend to have quite high management intensity because they're being managed for specific habitats or specific species. So they're very outcome focused, and often they'll have quite intense management regimes to meet those outcomes. Rewilding projects shown on the blue here have lower management intensity, and generally what we're trying to do is work at larger scales to give natural processes those space to function. So we don't have set outcomes. We're not looking to create this amount of woodland, this amount of scrub, this amount of peatland, for example. It's putting the pieces in place and then seeing the mosaics that rewilding and natural processes create. And so as we've got more scale, we can create more of those mosaics, and we can start to see these natural processes functioning. When I talk about natural processes, what am I talking about? And I'm sure many on this call probably already know, but again, it's good just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So natural processes are interactions that support life. So it could be seasonal change, life and death. Death in particular is actually quite an important natural processes that we're missing from quite a lot of our landscapes. We don't really have many carcasses in our landscape, which really does disrupt that nutrient cycling, and also providing foraging opportunities for things like eagles and other scavengers. Weather, geological processes, the water cycle and soil formation are 2 very key elements of natural processes and rewilding that will be quite central to quite a lot of the rewilding projects that we see. Impacts of animals from grazing and habitat succession. So these 2 tend to be grouped together. So habitats will naturally want to succeed from grassland to scrub to woodland, and then the animals are here to kind of knock that back and disrupt that linear succession. So they'll be creating these changing mosaics through their grazing, through trampling, through other natural behaviours that you start to see. And those are the really important dynamics of rewilding, and actually creates quite a lot of niches for lots of different wildlife to return. So when we're talking about letting natural processes lead, I tend to like to use this picture of a game of Jenga, because it's quite a good visual to think about how our ecosystems are at the moment and what rewilding is trying to do. So I've already said that natural processes need space, and although you can rewild at garden level or small holding level, the more space you have, the easier it is. The less you have to manage and intervene and kind of mimic those natural processes, and the more that you can let natural processes dictate what happens within that landscape. But also we need to have all the puzzle pieces in place. So if we think about a game of Jenga, a lot of our ecosystems have had some of those blocks taken out. They can still function, but when we're looking at their stability and their resilience to things like extreme weather and climate change, they're really wobbly. So they're not necessarily functioning or the most resilient ecosystems that we have. Rewilding is thinking about, are there pieces that we can put back into that Jenga tower that will make it more resilient to these extreme weather and climate change and other things, that will also help it to function better. So some of those missing pieces might be things like leaky dams to mimic beavers. It might be species reintroductions themselves, so things like bison, beavers, pine martens, eagles, that are all contributing to the function and the complexity of that ecosystem. Some of it might be mimicking natural herbivore grazing. So once we would have had semi-natural herds of wild horses, aurochs, which is the wild cattle that became extinct, wild boar, as well as the deer, moving through these landscapes and grazing on different elements throughout the year. So we're trying to mimic that on rewilding projects by putting low numbers of proxy animals, so cattle, pigs and horses, and then we might be harvesting those to mimic the missing wolves and lynx that we don't have here. When we're looking at woodland, things like coppicing can be mimicking the impacts of bison and beavers, and also even in some places sustainable forestry, like continuous canopy forestry, could be mimicking some of those natural processes of trees falling or animals taking those trees out. So it's just having a think about what natural processes might we be missing. Can we put some of those back in, like rewiggling rivers, or some of the other things I've already listed? And if we can't, how can we mimic those to try and improve the resilience of those ecosystems and restore some of those natural processes? Another question I get asked quite a lot is, have we got the space? We have targets from COP15, as well as UK government targets for 30% nature recovery by 2030. And we're doing some work at the moment to map where those areas could be and whether we have the space for them. But as a general rule, we're looking at low-grade agricultural lands, so grades 4 and 5 land that aren't producing much food, but can produce loads more benefits if they were rewilded, including carbon, flood mitigation, and all sorts of other things. And it's good to just remember that 86% of the land in the UK is non-urban, so that's farmland. We've got quite a high proportion of grouse moors and deer stalking estates in Britain as well. So once we put all of those in and start to look at some of the products that rewilding can produce, we do ultimately have space for that. And we will be releasing a report later this year to start to highlight some of the land transition decisions we might need to make to be able to support that amount of rewilding. And I can't talk about rewilding without thinking about the role of keystone species, and I've already mentioned a few of them. But one of the key elements of rewilding is thinking about what species might be missing from our landscapes, and how restoring them might help to restore some of those natural processes and some of that complexity that should be there within our ecosystems. So obviously there's the missing predators like wolves and lynx, and at the moment we're mimicking their role within the landscape through deer management or harvesting animals. But if we had them back, they would probably be able to do it much better than we do. Lots of beavers are being reintroduced and are actually present across most of Britain now, which is restoring those wetland opportunities as well as water filtration and natural flood mitigation. We've got wild boar, but they're limited to certain areas in Britain, mostly in the Forest of Dean, and they have a role to play in terms of rootling around and turning over the soil and creating that complexity and I guess messiness, for want of a better word. And then we're also missing quite a lot of our semi-natural herbivores. So the big, large herbivores that would once have been roaming around Britain. We don't have elk here anymore. We do have lots of deer, but in England, we don't have as many red deer, for example. And they would have had quite a big impact on a lot of our woodlands as well as our landscapes. So thinking about where it might be appropriate to bring some of those natural behaviours back is incredibly important to create these mosaics. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the benefits of rewilding and why we need to consider rewilding in Britain. We did a report a couple of years ago that was looking at the impact of climate change on our habitats and species. And it found that the UK's climate on average is moving northwards at a rate of 5 kilometres per year. So that means that animals that have specific climate and habitat needs need to move 5 kilometres per year to be able to keep within the range that they are currently in to be able to survive. So to do that, we need to think about how are we allowing these animals and habitats to move at such a high rate? Do we have that connectivity to allow them to move within the landscape? And when we're looking at rewilding, really connectivity is just as much of an important element as the actual rewilding itself. So this is a diagram from the IUCN rewilding guidelines to start to illustrate how these different features could work together at the landscape scale. So where we have core rewilding areas, we might have stepping stones, smaller rewilding areas as well. We might have other land uses like nature reserves or, I don't know, forestry areas or parkland or river corridors that can connect these core areas up and really start to allow that movement of species throughout the landscape. And I think ultimately that's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking at the landscape scale. We need to think about these mosaics as well as these corridors of how animals can move within that landscape. And we've started to record lots of benefits of rewilding. And I think it's always important to remember that the UK is 189th out of 218 countries for biodiversity intactness, which is pretty shocking, actually. And I find it quite embarrassing every time I'm using that, that fact, because we really can be doing so much better than that. And what we're doing by building the evidence base for rewilding is starting to show that it can draw down carbon from the atmosphere. As I've already said, it helps wildlife to adapt to climate change. It can reverse some of that biodiversity loss, as well as improving our own health and well-being. So there's lots of things that rewilding has to offer, and we're only really scratching the surface in terms of what can be supported by rewilding projects. Through the work I've been doing with projects on the ground is we've started looking at the impacts that they're having on people as well, and I do need to update these numbers. But across 50 sites in England and Wales, we saw an increase of actually now over 50% jobs, full-time equivalent jobs pre and post rewilding, and that's within 10 years of rewilding. We've seen a massive increase in the number of volunteer opportunities, and also all the sites in England and Wales that were within these sample are still supporting grazing animals, just in much lower areas. So we can start to see not only are there more jobs being supported by rewilding, but there's also a higher diversity of those jobs as well, and we can start to directly relate that back to the impacts on people. So what does rewilding look like? This is a real whistle-stop tour of some of the example projects, but we did this uplands animation a couple of years ago to try and look at what could a rewilded landscape look like in Britain. And we've been quite imaginative with this. Obviously, there are some fun things in here, like the lynx lounging on the tree or the eagle flying off with a wild boar. But if you look carefully here, it's just a messier landscape. So we're trying to look at things like braided, re-wiggled rivers. There's a big beaver dam on this river as well. Got more trees within this landscape, and a lot of it will be natural regeneration, but there might be some forestry in here as well, but it's all blended together rather than in straight squares. We've got animals within this landscape, so we've got herbivores. We've also got people in here as well working within these landscapes, maybe a diversity of new different enterprises. So when we're talking about rewilding, we're really trying to think about how can we have more of these messier mosaics of different habitats with some of those species back in them as well. And I'm lucky enough to work with a range of projects through the Rewilding Network. And what I can honestly say is that each rewilding project is unique. They all have a slightly different approach to what they're doing, from allowing and encouraging natural regeneration of scrub and woodland, mostly in the lowland sites, through to tree planting and supplementary planting in the uplands where there isn't a seed source. And so we need to restore that seed source to then allow natural processes to to take over. It's really exciting to see this whole dynamic, different approach to rewilding. But that also comes with some challenges, especially around funding. You can't go to a funder and say, this is what this landscape is going to look like in 10, 20 years time, because instead of being outcome focused, really it's just saying, well, we're going to try these different things. It's still quite young and innovative, so we're not quite sure what's going to happen, but we're letting natural processes lead the way. And I think I've got a slide on NEP in a couple of slides times, but I think the NEP estate, if anyone doesn't know, started off as an arable farm in West Sussex. They weren't making any money from it. It was low productivity farmland. So they decided to stop farming it and see what happened if they then kind of stopped working on it, see what emerged. And I don't think they had any ideas in their heads of exactly what it was going to look like. And I think even now they're still not quite sure how it's going to develop. But that's a massive thing to try and go to funders and say, well, we're not sure what's going to happen. 20 years on, we can see what's happened now, and it's incredibly exciting. But there is a real challenge there around talking to funders and working with existing funding streams to allow rewilding to happen. So focusing on woodland creation, which is the focus of this session, woodland creation is very central to most of the rewilding projects. A lot of them will be focusing on trying to create that mosaic, which will bring back a mosaic of grassland and scrub and woodland. Wood pasture is quite a focus of most of the rewilding projects, and that's because they can access countryside stewardship funding for wood pasture. And as I said, there's a whole range of different approaches. So we put a report together called Rewilding Britain, which is on our website if anyone wants to read it. And that has 3 steps to woodland expansion working with natural processes. So step 1 is encouraging natural regeneration, and that might be through taking some grazing animals off the land, changing the type of grazing from maybe sheep to more of a low density cattle, maybe horses, maybe some pigs, and trying to encourage that natural regeneration of scrub and woodland and that messiness that will come through. The second stage is supplementary planting. So you might encourage natural regeneration, but you might need to supplementary plant some tree species there, especially if there isn't a natural seed source. And then the third step is tree planting, if there isn't a natural seed source in the area, to really kickstart that rewilding and get things going, but to then allow natural regeneration afterwards. And as I said, this can be quite challenging because rewilding isn't working to set outcomes. And we are also working at scales that can mean it's quite difficult to know exactly what's going to establish where, but that also makes it incredibly exciting because we get this complexity that maybe we won't be able to replicate ourselves. So I'm just going to provide some examples and hopefully this video will work. I'll play it a few times. So this is the NEP estate, and this is a time-lapse image of the natural regeneration. So obviously this is starting as an arable field in 2001, and then it will start playing through the natural regeneration that happened. The project team dug out the pond here, so the pond isn't naturally regenerating, that's something they put in. But the trees came in naturally afterwards. They didn't do any tree planting in this area. And this is over a period of 15 years. So you can start to see how quickly the scrub and the trees have come back into this area. And actually it's very wooded there now. There's actually, I'm just going to stop it on that last one. Not going to let you pause it. That end picture is what it looks like now. You can see it's incredibly wooded. It doesn't look anything like an arable field anymore. And that's all been self-seeded through natural regeneration. And this is something that we see quite often in the lowlands, is in particular in England, because generally there does tend to be that natural seed source there that allows this natural regeneration to happen. In contrast to that, we also have upland rewilding projects like RSPB Haweswater in the Lake District. And if they were trying to allow natural regeneration in this area, it would probably take an awfully long time because they didn't have that natural seed source. So in areas like this, we see that approach to supplementary planting, where they go in and they might plant in bracken, or they might plant with tree tubes to just get that seed source back into the area. And then in the future, they will then allow natural regeneration from those seed sources. So I think it depends on where you're working and what pieces of that puzzle is there, depending on what approach you take. But across all of the projects, funding for these different approaches can be quite tricky in a rewilding context. But in Horsewater, they've also reintroduced grazing animals, including fell ponies and cattle, to again create that mosaic of different land uses. And just to wrap up, I work with a whole range of projects through the Rewilding Network. This is a network for practitioners to help support knowledge exchange, connection with other projects. And we're trying to build the practical content around how to approach rewilding, how to access funding, all sorts of different questions. So if there are any practitioners on this call, then please feel free to join the network. It's free to join. If you don't have any land or you're not a practitioner, but you're really interested, if you want to go onto our website, you can click on any one of these projects and it will tell you the approach that they've taken and how to find out more information as well. So take a look at that if you want to find out more. And that's it from me. I know that was a real quick whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it gave you a flavour of rewilding and how woodland creation can fit into that and some of the challenges. But I'm very happy to take any questions you have. And I guess the take-home message is whenever we're thinking about rewilding, we're thinking as big as we possibly can and how can we restore those natural processes. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. I've made a lot of notes there. Does anybody have any questions, or do we want to give Sarah a virtual round of applause and then we'll take some questions? Okay, claps. So we did have one question in the chat which we could start with. I don't know, Alice, if you'd like to turn on your mic and ask, or yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, can you currently see me? I can't tell.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, the rewilding approach, you talked a little bit about doing it from a like in lots of rural environments, given the fact that, like you said, something like 86% of the UK is like, you know, farmland and stuff like that. Are there ways that this approach could be used like in urban environments where there are, because obviously there is like the skew towards people being in people generally tend to live in urban environments, and therefore you get different kinds of benefits depending upon where you live, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to ask.
Urban environments, they're under quite a lot of pressure, so it's harder to rewild those areas because often our green space is recreational and sometimes it can cause some conflict. There are two projects that are urban rewilding. There's one in Alice Tree Park in Derbyshire, and there's also one in Greater London that's being led by Citizen Zoo. And they are trying to embrace rewilding principles whilst rewilding around about, I think it's about 40 hectares, so quite a significant area. For the rest of the rewilding areas that in urban areas that don't necessarily have that space, I kind of see those as really important stepping stone habitats, but inevitably at those smaller scales, they probably will require a bit more intervention. But then if you're working in urban environments anyway, that's a good opportunity to get people engaged with it, out helping with some of these areas. So I think you can absolutely rewilding in urban areas, but I think it's going to be more of that high interventionist part of that graph that I started with, creating those stepping stones that maybe can lead out to some of the larger areas on the outskirts or further out into the rural countryside. I also think that rivers have a really key role for that, and they can provide a really nice natural corridor that can connect the urban areas through to maybe some of the rewilding areas. And what we're trying to start to support is projects that can start to connect through. So there's another project in Lincolnshire called Wilder Doddington, and they have a cycle path that links Lincoln to where they are. And they're again looking at how can they create that as a nice corridor to link out to those, not just for people, but also for wildlife to link to that rewilding. So yeah, it's still work in progress, but it's definitely, there's some promising things that are happening there.
Cool, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yeah. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? You can either raise your hand or pop it in the chat. If not, I do have a few questions of my own. Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead then. So it's interesting that you said how these projects are planned. You know, they're not 50-year projects, they're, you know, over a course of multiple generations. What sort of process is in place to sort of revise the plans as we go through time? Because, you know, maybe they aren't as successful as they could be in 50 years time because of unexpected climate change and stresses like that. So
yeah, so I think there's that ambition to have that long-term vision and long-term thinking, But rewilding projects are still constrained with the fact that funding maybe goes 10, 20, 30 years maximum. And I think there are mechanisms throughout that process. You know, we're always learning, and as an organisation, we're pulling together a monitoring framework as well to start to measure that rewilding progress across the network, but also to help projects themselves to be able to monitor that progress and understand what's happening. So I think, yeah, it's good to remember that rewilding is still quite new and innovative, and I think all of the projects on the network fully accept that they're kind of learning as they go, and they'll have to kind of revise it along the way. I imagine all of those projects that have a 100-year vision will have to revise them quite regularly, because as you say, we've got climate change to deal with, we've got extreme weather, but also we don't really know what's going to happen on a lot of these rewilding projects. So, you know, there might be some surprises along the way that will require them to change that vision too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What kind of variables are people monitoring to measure the success of rewilding projects, or what are they planning to measure?
So we're looking at things like vegetation structure, using LiDAR to try and see if we can see that change over time. We're also looking at ecosystem services, so things like water quality, flood mitigation, carbon. A lot of projects are also trying to access biodiversity credit funding, so they're trying to measure biodiversity uplift using different species. I think those are the main things. We're also looking at soundscapes to see if we can use that to start to see that complexity. So it's still being developed, but yeah, the kind of quite top level indicators to tell us the big picture is the main thing that we're looking at. And I think vegetation structure and LiDAR is going to have a really key role in that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sorry, we've just had another question in the chat. Peter, do you want to come on camera, or I can read it out?
Sorry, there's two of us in the room, so I'm just going to maybe competing voice-wise.
Sorry.
Hi, Sarah. Just that comment between lower ground and natural regeneration sources, and where we're dealing with stuff in Cumbria, which is very often incredibly depauperate of actually multiple species, not just tree species, but actually wildflowers and everything else. It's where do we start the rewilding process from, and how do we get to that point? And a lot of that's about discussions about what should be in that landscape, because we have very few exemplars here anyway of what that landscape could look like. The rewilding thing suggests to me that actually it doesn't, in some respects, it doesn't really matter as long as it's messier and wilder. But there are schools of thought about what we should be heading for. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Oh, it's a really tricky one, and you'll probably know more than me about what species could and should be there. I think generally I take the view that for rewilding, it doesn't matter too much, but we're really focusing on those ecosystem functions. But of course, there will be a whole load of relationships between tree species and invertebrates and those food webs that we talk about. So it is really tricky. And I think generally for the upland areas of England and also Scotland, we take quite a lot of, we try to have a look at Norway and see if we can be influenced by what's happening in Norway as a kind of example, but that's also not perfect. So I don't know whether I've got the answer for you really, other than just testing things out and seeing and helping with that knowledge exchange between different projects to see what's appearing and what's supporting there, and trying not to be too strict with what should be there or what shouldn't, I guess. I don't think that really answers your question, but
no, I think what I'm saying is actually we need to be quite relaxed about what comes.
Yeah.
Try novel approaches occasionally, and try and first guess what's there, but without being too het up whether we get A, B, or C coming out.
I think so. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've got two more questions in the chat, so if we could ask those really quickly so we can move on, but I don't know whether you have to leave, so I would like to ask you these before you go. So we've got a question from Ian. So how does rewilding work with legislation associated with land use change, such as EEI determination?
Well, I've got a really quick answer to that. We have a legislation and regulations guide that we're about to publish in the next couple of weeks, and that has a whole load of information in there about EIA. So instead of me going through it now with us being short of time, maybe that's something to look out for, and you'll be able to have a look at it then, and we'll probably answer it much better than I'll be able to.
Wonderful. Yeah, and another question from Amy. So she says, thanks. Do you think that we'll ever get to the point where humans would not need to intervene with ecosystems in the UK, especially if there is too much socio-political resistance towards reintroduction of top predators like wolves?
I think we need to remember that we are also part of that ecosystem. So I wouldn't ever see a point where we're not intervening, because we do have a role to play within our ecosystems. I think hopefully there will be a point where we don't have to intervene as much, because a lot of those pieces of the puzzle will be back. But even with wolves and lynx, you know, even in mainland Europe where these predators are back, there's still a role for humans to play in that landscape, and we should do anyway, because we are part of those natural processes. So I'd say no, but probably less intervention than there is at the moment.
Okay, thank you. That was really great. Maybe another round of applause, and we'll hand over to Lindsay for her presentation. Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Hello, can you see my presentation? Just a moment.
It's not in full screen. Yeah, it's
Doing that again, isn't it?
yeah.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, now we see the contents page.
Okay, all right, I'll start. Hopefully this will work. Hello, so I'm going to be talking about the ERAMP programme, which is the Environment and Rural Affairs Monitoring and Modelling Programme in Wales, and I work at UKCEH. So I'm going to do an introduction to ERAMP and also its predecessor, which was called GMEP, the Glacier Monitoring Evaluation Programme. What we measure in field survey, examples of results from GMEP, other evidence sources, some findings from National Forest Evidence Review, further analysis of data, and then we do some integrated modelling. So ERAMP and GMEP, it goes a bit further than just woodland and trees. We look across all habitat types, but hopefully I've focused on some examples that sort of cover woody features within the landscape. So ERAMP is a UKCEH-led partnership of over 20 organisations. We've got funding of 50 million from the Welsh Government and UKCEH. It's a 5-year programme which started in 2018, but we had a previous programme before that, which was from 2012 to 2016. The objectives are to provide ongoing evidence and support for a wide range of requirements for policy development, and trying to directly influence that policy development. There's a website there at the bottom. They've got a really good website with lots of information. So ERAMP is a bit of an expansion on what happened in GMEP. We carry out a lot of monitoring, but there's also a whole section on modelling and providing evidence, integrated assessments and analysis and reviews. It's a unique data, evidence and modelling resources to underpin policy and also to explore scientific questions. I've got some examples from some scientific papers that we've published. The monitoring design is a structured, systematic approach. It's based on a series of land classes within Wales, which have 30 environmental variables, including soils and geology. It's an approach that is based on the countryside survey system, which was established in 1978. We exploit data and establish protocols consistent with other schemes. So we link in with the BTO and the breeding bird survey, also the butterfly monitoring. But the idea is that we try to integrate across lots of different initiatives. We have a common sampling unit of 1 kilometre square and use new data and existing data. There's a rolling survey of 301 kilometre squares that were first carried out in GMEP, and we're doing a resurvey of 250 of these, which started in 2021. So what we actually measure, we've got correlated measurements within the square so that we can look at interactions between all of the different things that we're measuring. We're looking at vegetation composition, soil and peat depth, soil erosion, ponds, headwater streams, pollinators, birds, woodlands, landscape photography, historic environmental features and public footpaths. we're trying not to duplicate monitoring that's carried out under the Water Framework Directive or air quality monitoring or FI. So we do things that complement those other surveys. We have many vegetation plots. It can be up to 52 in a 1 kilometre square. We have large ones of 200 metre squares, and we have smaller 2x2s. We target particular features within a landscape, so field margins and hedgerows and stream sides, and they to be able to sample all elements that you have within a landscape. There's different things happening in those different elements. For instance, our linear features tend to be good as refugia. We also do soil samples at 5 locations across the squares, and there's 3 0 to 15 centimetres cores, and then those are analysed for a series of different physical and chemical measurements, including soil carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus, bulk density. We also measure the peat depth as our surveyors go around. There's a new, we started measuring soil erosion fairly recently, and that's ground truthing some features that were provisionally detected using aerial photography, and then the surveyors go out and check whether that feature is there. We survey ponds, we select one pond for a condition assessment in each square and look at the physical characteristics and the wetland macroinvertebrates. We also look at headwater streams, carry out river habitat survey and look at various river characteristics. We sample the biota and look at 5 diatom samples, and also take lots of measurements on environmental variables. Pollinators, the method follows the wider countryside butterfly survey methodology. So the squares are surveyed twice over the season. We have a fixed route along 2 linear transects. There's 10 continuous sections, and the survey routes are 500 metres apart and 250 metres in from the edge of the square. And then within those transects, we record pollinating insects, flowering plants, and weather conditions. We also map bird territories. As I mentioned, this follows the methodology of the BTO breeding bird survey, and all the birds on the transects are mapped, identified by sight and sound, and the square is visited throughout the field season, so twice through the course of the breeding season. And then because we've got these co-located measurements, we can link that to what's happening in other types of element like the vegetation structure. And we also survey all of the woody features within a 1 kilometre square. So we asked our surveyors to go and to map woodlands, where they record the dominant tree species and the ground flora presence and cover. They also record the structure and size of trees. We tried to record areas of new planting, and we also look at the type of woodland and some contextual information. We've always recorded trees outside of woodland, so hedgerows, where we look at hedgerow diversity of the woody linear features and also the ground flora. And we also look at management as well as the extent and structure of the hedgerow. And then we try to record individual and veteran trees. And for the veteran trees, we have a series of measurements of extra condition measures that we record. Yeah, so there's an awful lot of data. After GMEP, we carried out fairly significant analysis, and some of the results from that, we initially in GMEP, we were just looking at, because Glastier was just starting, Glastier is the agri-environment scheme in Wales. So because it was just starting, the analysis focused on looking at areas that were in Glastier and outside of Glastier, as well as looking at national trends and linking to previous monitoring. So we could find some initial findings of what the impact that Glastier might have had. So there was an increase in the number of farms restoring or creating woodland compared to non-scheme farms, and this differed depending on whether you're in the entry level or advanced. And woodlands were more likely to be managed for wildlife habitat rather than shelter for livestock if the farms were in the advanced level of Glastier. There was quite a low uptake of the Glastier woodland options at that time. So using predictive modelling, it was only likely to be a small increase in the area accessible to broadleaf woodland species. That was using the Lucy model. They did a bit of exploration of the barriers to uptake in the farmer practice survey and through focus groups and structured interviews. And they tried to find out what the main reasons for not taking up a grant was. And that some of that was not interest in woodland management, the lack of available land, insufficient time to diversify, insufficient knowledge or equipment, or that the scheme was too complicated. But I should stress with this that this was quite early on in the glass tier scheme, and we've just started carrying out a large analysis of the resurvey, which will try to look at what the actual impacts of glass tier options has been. So national trends, just kind of trying to emphasize that we've got an awful lot of data and we can look at it in very many different ways. This is just some of the national trends of what's been happening in the woodlands. We linked the survey in GMEP up to the survey in Countryside Survey, which is how we're able to go back in time. And we found that there seemed to be an increase in plants that indicated good condition. So this was ancient woodland indicators. There was a recent increase in woodland birds in the woodland bird indicator in the breeding bird survey. And there was stability in a lot of the other metrics, looking at connectivity, patch size, light shade index. We did find no change in the area of small woodlands. So yeah, again, these results going back to sort of 2017. So we will have some more up to date. We also look at national trends in hedgerows, where we didn't find much of a change in the lengths of woody linear features. We did find that hedgerows were getting wider with fewer large gaps, so possibly an indication that there's been less management. And there was a decrease at the time in new planting and in laying or coppicing, but it would be interesting to see whether that's something that's increased with all the new initiatives that there've been and the emphasis on creating new woodland. So as well as the evidence that we collect within the field survey, we try to use other sources of evidence as well. So citizen science, earth observation, I'll mention the modelling at the end, carbon footprinting, farmer practice surveys, citizen surveys. And we've also undertaken quite large evidence reviews, which include the evidence pack to support sustainable farming and also the National Forest Review. And that, so here we've got a series of reports. We look at a lot of different elements, and it was to provide key evidence of the benefits and disbenefits of woodland creation, woodland expansion, and also managing undermanaged woodland to inform the development of a national forest for Wales. So one of the chapters that I was particularly involved in was the biodiversity chapter. And here we were just highlighting that there's positive and negative impacts on biodiversity depending on the current site condition, the value of habitat to be converted, although there is a lot of protective legislation to avoid negative impacts, and also special consideration for priority species. The type of woodland and the tree species are obviously going to impact in different ways. The management, what land is adjacent to it, the proximity to other woodland connectivity, so you're likely to have more success in dispersal of woodland species if you can plant near to existing high quality woodland or ancient woodland. Connectivity can be good or bad, good in terms of dispersal, bad in terms of dispersal of disease or non-native species or predators. And woodland size is also quite important as well, that where larger woodlands have more ecological niches and support large populations, whereas the small woodlands can support the woodland edge species, but they might not have the conditions for the woodland interior specialists. These impacts vary at different stages of the forest rotation regeneration cycle and within different taxa. And environmental heterogeneity within and between the woodlands and in the surrounding landscape promotes the development of distinct communities. So we've got this amazing data resource. We've used it in various different ways. So further analysis of the data was trying to determine if we could measure and map high nature value farmland. So the HMV type 1 and 2, type 1 is related to the amount of semi-natural land in the landscape, and type 2 is a bit more to do with heterogeneity and multiple landscape metrics. So it's a theory that those types of landscape heterogeneity in semi-natural land are associated with higher species richness. So that's how you identify areas of high nature value. So we did an analysis within our 1 kilometre survey squares and looked at some of the metrics, including broadleaf, woodland, connectivity and cover, hedgerow density, habitat diversity, patch size and soil diversity. And we looked at those relationships between some of our diversity data. In this case, we used birds and plants. And then using the relationships that we identified in the survey squares, we extrapolated nationally using remotely sensed data to try to identify where you could find high nature value farmland. And we created these maps. So the idea with this is you create a measurement of the extent of the farm, and you try to repeat the analysis and can see how that's changed over time. And that's something we'll be looking at again in the reanalysis of the eRamp data. And also done some other work on landscape heterogeneity, looking at the relationship between heterogeneity and habitat area. Because as landscape heterogeneity increases space, which should increase species richness, it has been thought that there might be a trade-off with habitat area, particularly for the habitat specialists that need quite large contiguous areas of habitat, and sort of fragmentation and additional habitats might be detrimental for those. So there's a theory that a unimodal relationship is more likely, and that you'll get a decline. As you get higher levels of heterogeneity, you'll get a decline in species richness, and that will particularly be these narrow niche specialists. So I was looking at this in our data with plant species richness, and also included land use intensity as a covariate, and found that the shape of the relationship does vary with land use intensity, the type of heterogeneity, spatial scale, diversity type, and niche width. So that although heterogeneity can increase species richness, there might be trade-offs at higher heterogeneity. But it's particularly likely in modified landscapes where you might have lost a lot of your narrow niche species, and that can constrain the response to heterogeneity. So as was mentioned in the previous talk, as your species pools get reduced, it's more difficult to introduce measures that are going to improve species richness, and you might have to take additional action to bring other species in. Other recent applications of the data is looking at hedge creation for birds. Hedge creation funded by glass tier payments happened most frequently where there were already moderate to high densities of hedges. And again, it's coming back to the idea that there's different species benefit or have disbenefits. So creation of hedges, it was positive for hedge species such as yellowhammer, but at high density bird species which require more open space decline, such as skylark and lapwing. And yes, so just another paper was looking at our pollinator data in a bit more detail, and finding that pollinator abundance is consistently higher in broadleaved woodland, and the abundance is about 1.5 times higher for mining bees and 2 of the hoverfly groups. Hedgerows and lines of trees as well contribute to abundance in agriculturally improved habitats, up to 14% for honeybees and 21% for hoverflies. Let's go back. Also, unsurprisingly, all of the insect groups, the abundance increases with flower cover. And it's just emphasising the role for woodland creation, but also linking up the hedge laying, having those woody features outside of woodlands and some kind of connectivity, as well as farmland heterogeneity, and how important those are within land management incentive schemes. So finally, I was just going to mention the integrated modelling platform within eRamp, and this isn't something I've worked on myself, so I just wanted to tell you about it. It's a tool for rapid exploration of the effects of policy and management interventions. It takes an integrated approach, recognising that policy effects in one sector can have indirect effects in other sectors. And there's basically a chain of specialised models which look at agriculture, forestry, land use allocation decisions, biodiversity, ecosystem services and valuation. And the user specifies interventions and model outputs, and these are aligned where possible to support and inform policy development. So there was quite a lot of work using this to look at post-EU exit trade deals, and it's currently being used for the sustainable farming scheme. So 6 land use scenarios were provided by Welsh Government, and that was based on a series of workshops. 2 of these are going to just look at some outputs from in more detail, but it's basically looking at free trade areas with the EU only, or free trade areas with all the countries. And these are going to influence the countries that going to influence the farmers that come out of farming. So here we've got new woodland. This shows the simulated areas of new woodland establishment through natural regeneration and afforestation on farms that are expected to go out of agriculture. Afforestation will be considered if the land will generate a positive net present value and is suitable for tree growth. If conditions on land that leave agriculture are not met for afforestation and land is suitable for trees, natural regeneration to unmanaged woodland is simulated. And if the land is not suitable for trees, natural regeneration to short vegetation is assumed. So it's just using all of the models linked together to try to predict what your land use may look like in the future. And this one is looking at habitat suitability for plants. It's using the multi-move models. Projected gains in woodland over 25 years result in expected increases in the suitability of conditions for woodland specialist plants. Gains in temporary grassland drive positive impacts on the small number of modelled arable specialists. Movement out of farming benefits many of the semi-natural habitat specialists modelled, except for the lowland heathland groups, which decline because they're susceptible to succession to woodland and scrub. So again, it's looking at different scenarios and trying to project changes in niche space and which species like to benefit from that and which species will decline. So yeah, in summary, ERAMP consists of all of these different elements and provides national trends of ongoing change in the wider countryside, quantifies the outcomes of glass tier, but also provides new policy relevant integrated modelling tool that can provide scientific evidence to inform evolving policies across sectors. And it's very much a community approach for expert reviews and integrated assessments. So trying to use the best available knowledge and the best available data. And it's also flexible and can adapt to changing policy needs. As I mentioned, the website, there's a lot more information on there that you can find out about. Okay, thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Lindsay. Shall we give virtual a round of applause? There we go. Does anybody have any questions? Either pop them in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, well, we'll have time for more discussion and questions at the end. So if you do think of anything in the meantime, you can pop it in the chat and we'll come back to it. Since we have time for one question now, I might ask one myself if that's okay. So I was just thinking about sort of other sort of land use scenarios and whether you include them. So my PhD specifically looks at the conversion of coniferous plantations to broadleaf forest, but I've mostly been focused on England. So I was wondering, do you know if that's something that's happening a lot in Wales? Is that a scenario you consider when assessing the success of sort of woodland creation and changes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a change that you'd hope would be happening, and I'm pretty sure it would have gone into the modelling. I have heard some discussion recently that because of the way that grants work, that there has been some of the new woodland created in one of our experimental catchments. It actually seems to be quite a lot of coniferous woodland being planted now because of carbon credits. You're getting funded to actually plant that. So although I'd assumed that moving to broadleaf woodland was the general trend that was going to happen, there has been some evidence that it's going back the other way. But yes, I think within the modelling, I'm sure that they've looked at broadleaved woodland and expansion of broadleaved over coniferous, because that is the way that you would expect things to go in terms of biodiversity and what's beneficial.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. If there's no more questions for the moment, then I think we can move on to Ben. If you'd like to share your screen, or we haven't practiced this, so hopefully it will work, but I have your presentation anyway if it doesn't.
People hear me, and can they see my screen?
Yeah, everything is perfect, thank you. It's not full screen yet. There we go, now that's fine, thank you.
So hello everybody, thank you for inviting us to join, and thank you for the two speakers beforehand. So my name is Ben Goh, I'm the commercial manager at Maelor Forest Nurseries, and I was asked to come and give a bit of an insight into forest nurseries, what we do and how that can sort of play into woodland creation. So hopefully my talk complements the previous two talks. In terms of Maelor, we're predominantly a wholesale nursery selling bare root trees, although we do a quantity of container grown trees, mainly for commercial sort of multifunctional forestry. So a slightly different spin to the previous two talks. My role is looking after the sales team and looking after sort of strategy relating to what we plant. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I should say at this point, I'm not a forester. So yeah, hopefully I can answer people's questions. But yeah, I'm mainly focused on the nursery. So what will I talk about today? I'll give an introduction to the nurseries, where we are, what we grow. I'll give an insight into how we grow trees. You can see in that picture there a typical field containing actually some Scots pine. It looks like wheat or something like that, but that's actually Scots pine trees. Just to give you an idea of scale, so those beds are 1.2 meters wide, and you might be looking at 300 trees per meter there. So they're kind of 40 centimeter tall trees. We're not talking about sort of the trees that you see on the Chelsea Flower Show or anything like that. It's a small bare root trees for planting in woodlands and forests. And then hopefully I'll give a bit of an overview of why we grow trees in the first place. Maybe I should have done that first, but I'll come to that at the end. Okay, so we have two nurseries, one here in Wales, which is where I'm based. You can see that just on the map down here on the English-Welsh border, just outside Wrexham. And then one up in Scotland near Murray, or in Murray, and between the two sites we grow somewhere in the region of 35-40 million trees a year. The site down here in Wales was established probably over 100 years ago as a Forestry Commission tree nursery, and has developed over time. So it's a lot more fragmented, as you can see from the map. And here there's about 40 different fields, covering 200 hectares. And as well as growing trees in fields, we've also got container grown production. We have our own seed orchards. We do a lot of trials on site. We do cuttings as well as seed grown crops. And we do a bit of indoor growing in terms of indoor growing of seedlings. And we have a lab for somatic embryogenesis, which is tissue culture, effectively, micropropagation of trees. Up in Scotland, it's a newer site that was established about 4 years ago. And because that was from a blank canvas, if you like, it's a much simpler layout. So 70 hectares divided over 5 large fields. So much simpler operations, no seed beds, no labs or trials or seed orchards up there. Okay. So our main activities are growing trees, as I mentioned, mainly bare root and cell grown stock. And also tree improvement is something that we've got a long history in. So that's selective breeding of trees for traits such as growth, form, or actually tolerance for things like drought. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what do we grow? So we grow somewhere in the region of 60 different species, but one thing which often people don't appreciate is that a tree can have a number of different provenances, for example. So you could have oak, which was the seed was sourced in Wales, for example, or you can source oak from, well, sessile oak from France, for example. You might be looking at native oak, just collected from a wild stand, or you could be looking at improved oak from a seed orchard, for example, from a breeding program. And there are breeding programs around the world, although the one in the UK is still in development at the moment. We then grade those trees into different sizes, so you can see that's our kind of bread and butter, which is Sitka spruce. That's a 2050 grade, which is the most common grade. So we grade it into different size bands for different plantings. So typically speaking, Woodland Creation will tend to plant a smaller size grade, whereas if you're restocking or filling in gaps in an established forest planting, then you might use larger stock, for example, 40 to 60 centimeters or 60 to 80, for example. And then there's a number of different ways of growing stock. So I won't go into detail in those, but it's to do with the age of the stock, whether you move it from the seed bed or whether indeed it's bare root or grown in a container. Okay. So we're ISO 9001 certified, and the reason I mention that is, as I'll talk about on the next slide, growing trees is, on the face of it, quite simple, but in practice, there's a lot of moving parts to it. And there's a lot of moving targets. We work with the weather rather than try to fight it. So we have to have quite a lot of flexibility in our workforce and moving around different tasks to try and to hit sort of optimum weather windows. So having all our processes sort of documented in a management system and continually trying to improve that is a big part of what we do here at Maelor. We're also ISO 14001 certified, so we've got an environmental management system, and that's around integrated pesticide management and ensuring that we're minimizing our environmental impact through what we do. We also take biosecurity very, very seriously, to the extent that we don't import any trees. So if you look at a lot of the pests and diseases which have been introduced into Britain over the past few decades, they've tended to come in mature stock, imported from outside of Great Britain. So things like ash dieback, things like oak processionary moth, pretty much every disease which you mentioned, which is affecting the health of our trees and the future of our forests in Great Britain, have been imported. And rightly or wrongly, we took the decision a few years ago not to import stock. So we kind of live and die by whether or not the crops grown on our nurseries make it or not. It does take away a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to take orders for sort of long lists of different species, but that means it's all the more important that we get it right. In terms of the species which we grow, so there's a list of the species which we've grown over the last, I think, 3 years. At any year, one or two of those may be missing from our sort of our stock list, just depending on sort of seed availability or whether indeed we had a failure on that particular crop. But generally speaking, you can see we grow roughly an even number of species of conifers and broadleaves, but it's fair to say that the majority, in terms of quantity, of volume, the majority of our production is conifers. And that's because our market is really split into, I suppose, two markets. One is woodland creation. And as the previous speaker mentioned, a lot of that has been conifer plantation. But the other half of our business is restocking. So that's where forests have been felled for timber and they're restocking for a next rotation, and that's almost exclusively conifers. So a quick sort of overview of some of the activities which we go through in the year. So, and there's no start and finish, it's a continuous cycle. So first of all, there's a lot of planning which goes on, you know, how we're going, what we're going to grow, when we're going to sow it, when we're going to do certain operations, how we're going to meet our labour requirements, irrigation, you know, when we're going to lift crops. So I'll give you a quick overview of the annual cycle. So we'll start nominally at seed sowing. So we usually start seed sowing around about March time, and that's dictated really by when the weather conditions are right to do it, and when we've got the labour available to do it. So you can see this first picture here up in the top right. That's a typical bed which is prepared. The seed has been sown, and then we've put a grit on top just to, you know, keep some of the moisture in there, keep some of the heat in overnight. I mentioned tree breeding and tree improvement. So what we've got here is an isolated cone of a Sitka spruce where we've done a controlled pollination. So we'll be doing those in sort of April time, depending on sort of flower maturity dates. We'll then be looking at transplanting. So you can see some, I think that's black poplar, where we've taken cuttings and inserted those, and they struck. So that will again be in springtime. So spring's quite a busy time, can be quite a messy time in terms of you can have a plan, but as I said, if it's too windy, for example, to sow the seed, birch, you need a wind speed generally below sort of 4 miles per hour, because birch seed is very fine and it will just blow off the bed. So you have to sort of make a plan, but then be flexible within that, and you move people onto taking cuttings, for example, instead of sowing seed. Once the stuff is in the ground, then hopefully it grows, and that is again a function of the weather. We've just come out of, that's maybe a bit early to say that, but down here in Wales we had a good drop of rain over the weekend, but before that we'd had very hot dry weather for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We hadn't had rain for about a month, any meaningful rain for about a month. And bearing in mind a lot of our crop is grown out in the field, we do have some irrigation. There's no substitute for precipitation, so we do need the rain, we do need the right conditions in terms of temperature. We're vulnerable to things like late frosts, for example. Seed beds are very vulnerable to late frosts. So hopefully the crop's growing during this period, and simultaneously forest managers are coming out of their busy planting season and thinking, right, what am I going to plant next season? And so they're getting in contact, and we're trying to match up, okay, well, what do we think we're going to have against customers? Well, what do we think we're going to need, and trying to match those orders up. Bearing in mind what I was saying about we don't import stock, so we have to match the two pretty accurately. Once we get to the end of the season, which really is round about October, November, traditionally September, October, but actually with climate change, we've seen a longer growing season. We've seen warmer temperatures later on into the autumn. So we were actually still seeing quite a lot of growth into well into October, and the crops weren't going dormant until November and December in some cases, which is a challenge. Once we get to the end of that season and the trees stop growing, then we can start to do stock takes in terms of, I talked about size bands, we can start to measure the trees, do counts of what we've got in the fields, and then we can confirm those orders which we took earlier on in the season. As I mentioned, we're a bare root, predominantly bare root, so one of the main constraints there is around dormancy of the crop. So bare root stock needs to be dormant before you can lift it, otherwise you'll kill it. So we lift it when it's dormant, and then we put it into cold store. So that's at -2 degrees Celsius. So depending on when a crop goes dormant, which may be anywhere between October and January, we'll lift it and then get it into the cold store, and then we can dispatch it over a longer period of time. But there's again a race against time to get the stock lifted before it starts to wake up again. And again, with climate change, we're seeing warmer springs. So, you know, whereas previously you might have been safe on most crops till probably February, March time, it's unpredictable, and we can have quite warm weather. We had a warm spell I believe in January this year, and there was certainly an element of mortality due to trees waking up. And then we had some more cold weather in February, and you know that caused some damage to trees. So once the trees are in cold store, we can then dispatch them over the period, and we'll be dispatching to all over Great Britain. We're sending bare root stock out in coax bags, co-extruded plastic bags, which you can see here, and that can be to customers ranging from a few hundred trees for filling in some gaps in a previous planting, up to several 100,000 trees for a large woodland creation scheme, and everything in between. So yeah, that's a quick overview of the activities which go on the nursery. But it's fair to say that the key factors really are what the weather's doing, and as I mentioned, climate. You know, the changing climate does affect that, and labour availability, and equally labour availability in the wake of Brexit and the COVID pandemic have been quite challenging as well. So that drives us down the route of revisiting how we do our operations, and certainly automation is a key part of that. Okay, and that's where we are at the moment. We're roughly about there. So one of the things I was asked to sort of give an insight into is, you know, how do we plan ahead for what's required? And I just took oak as an example. It's not the longest lead time and it's not the shortest lead time, but hopefully it's something that people are familiar with. So, for example, the oak which we sent out this season, this winter, we started planning for that in June 2020, and there's a bit of, okay, well, what have previous years' requirements been? You know, what do we think's developing in terms of policy changes, in terms of competitors and availability? But it is a guess, really, as to how many trees will be needed in nigh on 3 years' time, because a lot can happen in that time. There could be in 3 years' time from now, there'll be a change in government. There could be a wholesale change in forestry policy. So it is a guess, but nonetheless, it's a commitment which we have to make pretty early on and pretty far in advance. So we'll start planning in June, and then from there we'll get in contact with seed collectors, and when the acorn harvest is ready, round about October, we'll start getting bags of acorns in. So just to give you an idea, I think this year we had about 10 tons of acorns delivered to the nursery. So October 22, we had about 10 tons of acorns delivered. And that highlights another aspect, which is mast years. So as you may or may not be aware, certain species have masting behavior, and oak is definitely one of those, and it's become quite extreme over the last couple of years. So this October, or this autumn just gone, was a very good year. There was a lot of acorns around, very large acorns, but the previous year there were virtually no acorns anywhere. So that plays into the production cycle, because if you haven't got any seed and you can't store the seed, which is the case for oak, not the case for all species, but certainly the case for oak, then it impacts your ability to grow trees. As I said, you can't store acorns, so we sowed those pretty much straight away, and how much we sow depends on how much we plan to sow, but also we'll have a bit of flexibility on that, and we'll look at what land availability we've got in terms of other species as well. If we haven't had any seed availability for a certain other species, then we may make that up with other species. So those oaks were sown in November 20. We then hope that they grow. Well, there's more than hope to it. We're operating as an experienced grower, but there are elements out with our control. So there are things like pest and disease which we have to control. So there'll be applications of fungicides, pesticides. We put netting up to keep squirrels off, to keep geese off the bed, at least until the oaks have germinated to the point where they, where they're past predation. And then we have to wait for the crop to go dormant. So oak is one of the last broadleaves to go dormant. This year is round about mid-December, so we're lifting that in January. And there will be losses in there due to weed competition or due to a wet patch in the field or whatnot. As I said, we'll lift that and then we'll put it into cold store and then dispatch that through the season. And some of those oaks are in the ground as we speak. So a little bit about where our seeds come from. So most of our seed comes from either collectors, people who do seed collecting as their livelihood, and they'll be regional based. So we'll have a few dozen collectors distributed across the country. They're not employed by us, they're independents, but we've worked with them for decades. There are a small number of seed traders within Great Britain, seed merchants. So we'll buy, different seeds from different regions, different provenances from each of those collectors or from that seed merchant. We also have seed orchards here on site and seed stands. So as I mentioned about tree breeding, we've established orchards to provide seed of desired specific genetic traits. So, faster growing, straighter timber production, drought resistance. Pest and disease resistance is something which is coming, but that requires quite a bit of work on the part of genomics in order to be able to identify those as yet unprioritized pests and disease. We also buy a bit from the state sector, from Forestry England. They sell some of their surplus from their own seed orchards and seed stands. We buy from the Conifer Breeding Cooperative, some seeds from them. And then there are certain species which we buy from overseas. So, for example, things like, I mentioned French oak, because they've got breeding programs there. It might be something like Pacific silver fir, which is an alternative conifer, which there isn't any sort of there isn't significant seed production in the UK because we're looking to diversify into that species. But we'll buy some of that from overseas as well. But again, it's worth mentioning that there is natural variability, variation in the availability of seeds, depending on what's going on in the world. And of course, the UK has fairly ambitious sort of afforestation targets. It's the same in other countries. So if they're producing seed of a specific species which is of interest, then it may be that they want to plant it in their own country, and then it's maybe not available for importing and growing on and planting over here. So coming on to the why of it, and as I mentioned, we're hopefully this complements sort of the previous speakers. There's lots of different reasons why you would look to increase tree cover, and I choose my words carefully. I'm saying increase tree cover rather than plant trees, because not all of those objectives involve planting trees. Some of them will be through natural regeneration, but where your objectives might be around amenity or agroforestry, for example, hedgerows, or indeed timber production, then generally speaking, some element of tree planting will be involved. And we're, as a nursery, we focus very much on productive forestry, and our drivers are really around timber and carbon. So we're not just interested in selling, millions and millions of trees. We're conscious that once you plant a tree, that's your choice made, that's your decision made, and you're locked into that decision until well, for the rest of that tree's life, really. So there are choices you can make around what tree you plant, and even once you've decided what species you're going to plant, around the provenance and the genetics of that tree. So just a couple of points here. So the UK only produces about 20% of the timber that it consumes. So the rest of that is grown elsewhere in the world. And whilst a lot of that is grown sustainably, because of supply chains, inevitably some of it is not. So there's a question mark. I don't presume to know the answer to it, but there's a question around, should we be growing more of that in the UK if we're using it? And actually the demand for timber is forecast to increase quite significantly over the coming decades. So that pressure for land and that pressure to produce timber sustainably is going to get more and more pronounced over the coming decades. So if we're growing timber, then if we're using timber, then we need to grow some of it. And if we're growing timber, then we need to think about how we grow that. And as I said, you can have difference in growth rates and timber production, and that's all about the choices you make in terms of provenance of the tree. And actually, in terms of carbon, timber is widely recognized as a sustainable building material, and it has the potential to significantly increase CO2 capture per hectare per year. A big chunk of that is through concrete displacement, so the use of mass timber, for example. So if you look at this diagram here, which is, let me just talk through it. So it's the tons of CO2 captured or avoided per year per hectare of woodland type planted in 2022. So, okay, faster growing trees will absorb CO2 faster, but that's not really the main reason why active forestry reduces carbon so much. It's predominantly around the use of that timber. So it's the timber captured in that in a product such as a timber frame building, and it's the avoidance of emissions from whatever it's replacing. So, for example, concrete. So the one thing I wanted to talk about is its CO2 reduction per hectare per year, and all of those points are important. Yes, we've got to reduce CO2. We're constrained in terms of land availability. We want to do things with our land, such as food production, such as living on it, such as amenity, such as rewilding. So we need to make the optimum use of each hectare we have, and per year, we do have a limited time in which to make these CO2 reductions. So we need to have a time element to that as well. I've talked quite a bit about provenance, and I suspect I'm probably running out of time, so I won't talk about that too much. But one thing that I wanted to pick up on is assisted migration versus local adaptation. And really there's well, in forestry, there's any number of different schools of thoughts. And one point that I wanted to make is that these are not either ors. All of these need to be taken into consideration and given their space within the trees that or the woodland that we're creating. But there is definitely a question around assisted migration versus local adaptation. And that's down to the forecast changes in climate across Great Britain, across the UK. And actually, different parts of the country are going to see different changes, faster changes, more extreme changes, and that factors into what species we should plant, or what species we should look to, or what trees we should look to plant in order that woodland thrives over its forecast life. So that may mean selecting provenances from further south, or it may mean conserving local genetics, collecting seed locally and replanting that. I won't go too much more into it than that, but suffice to say, it's not as simple as just planting the same thing that you've always had there in all cases. And so, for example, here's our silver birch seed orchard. You can plant a silver birch tree if there's silver birch growing there. This has been selected for growth rate and form, so it gives you the option, as well as meeting the sort of nature services that you might provide. You also have the option to capture more carbon, or even harvest that for timber in the future. And a point that Sarah made earlier, in certain cases, there isn't enough existing seed donors in the area. There isn't enough tree cover to contribute that seed to the landscape. And in that case, you may be looking at planting trees to introduce that into the landscape. We talk a lot about resilience, which I don't really like as a phrase, because it's a bit of a buzz phrase that doesn't, it means a lot of different things to different people. But similar to Sarah's point, the phrase which I saw recently is it's about building adaptive capacity. So building the capacity of that woodland to adapt to what is almost certainly going to be quite a lot of change in the coming decades. So a bit of a canter through the nursery and why we do what we do and how we do it. In summary, it's not just around species. There's also a lot of different choices around what provenance we select and grow. Weather and labour availability are key elements in the success or otherwise of our operations. There's a lot of forward planning. Oak, as we said, 3 years. Other species can easily be 5 years, 6 years in the growing. So that makes it very important, actually, when we're looking at woodland creation, which can have reasonably long lead times, to think about upfront, what you want to plant, and appreciating that that's not always known upfront. But the reality is that if it isn't thought about upfront, and then you want to plant certain species, or do certain things with that site, then you may be limited because the trees may not be available. And yeah, crucially, we select trees and produce for specific objectives, and those are wide ranging for different sites and different woodland creation activities. So thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful, that was really interesting. Thank you, Ben. Should we give a round of applause? There we go. So yeah, does anybody have any questions? You can raise your hand, pop in the chat. If not, I have lots of questions myself, because this is sort of a side of forestry that I'm actually not that familiar with. So it's super interesting to hear about it.